What will happen to our world if all the nations that possess nuclear weapons simultaneously enter a war and use their potential? In 2019, scientists from Princeton, the university, developed a possible scenario for doomsday. They modeled a situation in which a conflict begins between Western European nations and Russia. It'll all start with bombing major cities. Just imagine the population of such European capitals as Warsaw. Prague and Berlin vanish in a second. In response, the United States launches its nuclear missiles at Moscow and St. Petersburg, and then 6 other nations that have officially confirmed they have nuclear weapons in their arsenal and joined the war. These are China, North Korea, France, India, Pakistan, and the United Kingdom. This scenario for the course of events was titled Plan A. It shows how insane and destructive this obviously was. The war of humankind will be, however. There have been several moments in our history when the world was on the verge of a nuclear war, but what could have happened if the red button had been pushed? August 6 and 9, 1945, went down in history as being among the most terrible days in the entire existence of humanity. Then nuclear weapons were first used for military purposes, not on the testing ground. The United States Air Force dropped 2 atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima, Nagasaki during the final phase of the Second World War. The consequences of the explosions are pulling even today. The atomic bombs killed around 214,000 people in Hiroshima. Only shadows are left from those who happened to be outside at the moment of the explosion, but there could have been many more such cities in Japan. Colonel Paul Tibbets, the pilot of the aeroplane that dropped the atomic bomb called Little Boy on Hiroshima, claimed that the U.S. government wasn't planning to stop at just the 2 cities. According to Tibbets, he had 15 crude bombers ready under his command before the attack on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Nobody expected the Japanese government to capitulate so soon. Indeed, not the participants in the Manhattan Project. That's the code name for American nuclear weapon program, which formally commenced on August 13, 1319. Its scientific head was Robert Oppenheimer, an American theoretical physicist. The Manhattan Project was supposed to create an industry for manufacturing these deadly weapons. It could produce about 3 plutonium bombs per month and 1 uranium bomb every month or 2. The first nuclear test in the world, called Trinity, took place on July 16, 1945, in a New Mexico desert. The research was aimed at testing a plutonium bomb, nicknamed the Gadget. The scientists were excited by the results obtained. The explosion test turned out to be several times more powerful than they'd assumed. Immediately after Trinity, Lieutenant General Leslie Groves, a military supervisor of the Manhattan, the project told Oppenheimer that instead of 2, they'd probably need to drop 3 bombs according to the original plans, but which Japanese city could have been the next target? The 3rd bomb was supposed to fall in Japan on August 15, 1919. It became known from a declassified conversation between 2 American military officials. The nuclear bomb would have been identical to Fat Boy dropping on Nagasaki, and its initial target was Tokyo. However, most industrial facilities in Japan's capital have repeatedly undergone aviation bombings, while extensive residential areas had been destroyed in air raids, so the nuclear bomb wouldn't make such a terrifying impression there as it would in a city not affected by the war, nor would it give scientists a complete picture of the destruction necessary to continue developing the weapons. Therefore, for the next attack, they considered locations that had suffered minimal destruction. The list of targets booked for the strike included Yokohama, the 2nd largest Japanese city after Tokyo, Kakura and Igaga, and Kyoto. Japan's former capital was virtually undamaged by bombings during the Second World War and became under threat. And when the target had finally been approved, Henry Stimson, the United States Secretary of War, interfered. He kept trying to persuade Harry Truman until the last moment not to drop the atomic bomb on Kyoto. Did Stimson really understand that the bombing would cause catastrophic destruction and take the lives of millions of people? Of course, no. Apparently the Secretary Award was spent. His honeymoon in Kyoto, and he didn't want that particular city to be wiped out. Fortunately, Japan capitulated and it saved it from new bombings. However, what if the red button had been pushed anyway? Let's imagine Stimson did persuade the president not to drop the bomb on Kyoto. Then the most probable candidate for the next drink would be Tokyo. Then, on the night of August 1919, a bomber with a deadly load would have departed from the American military base. A few hours later, instead of dawn, Tokyo residents would behold an extraordinarily bright flash. A 21-kiloton explosion would rumble the city. Around 70,000 people who would happen to be in the epicenter at the moment of the explosion would die within seconds. Another 60,000 would receive severe injuries from a lethal dose of radiation. Within a few minutes after the explosion, about 30% of the city's population would die. Tokyo's wooden buildings of the last century's 40s would collapse like a house of cards. The Japanese emperor and his government would probably die in the nuclear attack as they were in the capital's downtown. Had the third atomic bomb fallen on Japan, it would have thrown the nation many centuries ago, and the consequences of the Second World War would be haunting. It's still now, but not only Japan would have been jeopardized because soon after the second during the war, the world found itself on the edge of a new full-scale nuclear war. A couple of weeks after the victory over Nazi Germany, the United States and the United Kingdom got down to developing military plans for destroying the Soviet Union. Those plans were aimed at destroying the communist state with a series of nuclear strikes. The operation was Coram Operation Unthinkable. The US and the UK feared that the USSR had placed so many of its troops in Europe that it thus posed a threat, considering that Stalin's moods were unpredictable. A new war couldn't break out at any moment, according to a note preserved in the archives of the American Federal Bureau of Investigation. Churchill, the British Prime Minister, believed that dropping an atomic bomb on the Kremlin would make it was easy to take the Soviet Union under control. Furthermore, a nuclear strike on the USSR would prevent Allied forces from casualties among American and British troops, but the UK wasn't the only one to plan to use atomic weapons against Stalin. According to documents from the period from 1945 to 1949, the Pentagon developed a total of 9 plans for a nuclear war against the Soviets. One of the most famous of them, developed in 1949, was codenamed Operation Drop Shot. According to this plan, the US was supposed to drop at least 300 nuclear bombs and 26,000 tons of regular bombs on 200 targets in 100 cities and towns of the Soviet Union, including Moscow and Leningrad, today's St. Petersburg. Moreover, a land military campaign against the USSR was to begin in order to ensure its complete defeat. According to the archives, war was scheduled to start on January 1, 1957. But what stopped the UK and the US? They fear millions of victims and potential destruction on almost half of the continent. No. For many years, their only obstacle was a lack of atomic bombs and planes. By 1948, Washington's arsenal comprised 50 atomic bombs and only 32 B-29 bombers which could carry them. But in 1949, the US produced another 250 nuclear bombs and Operation Drop Shot was about to begin. But then unexpected news took the world aback. The Soviet Union had developed its own atomic bomb. The American military realized that communists' nuclear potential was relatively small, but they couldn't ignore the fact that they had such weapons. Finally, in 1960, 12 years later, all the likely American strategies in case of a nuclear war were combined in the single integrated operational plan. If it had been implemented, there would have been a simultaneous mass nuclear strike on nuclear forces, military facilities, and major cities of the USSR, as well as China and Eastern Europe. Within a short time, U.S. strategic forces would have delivered 3,500 nuclear strikes on these territories. American generals assumed that this attack would take The lives of 285 to 425 million people, while some European allies would have to be wiped out. This plan could really have been brought into action during the Cuban Missile War crisis. On October 27, 1921, 62 could have been the last day in humankind's history. It went down in history as Black Saturday and became the culmination of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which lasted for 13 days. The world had never been so close to a nuclear war as it was in those 2 weeks. It all started back in 1960. During the pre-election presidential race in the U.S., the Eisenhower administration began the secret preparation of Cuban refugees in Guatemala. They were supposed to return home as a guerrilla party and gather revolutionary-inclined islanders to overthrow Fidel Castro. The secret plan was quickly revealed after the Guatemalan newspaper reported that the CIA had spent $1 million on real estate for the training. On April 17, 1961, the Cuban fugitives landed on the Bahia de Coinos beach, the Bay of Pigs. But it only took Castro's forces several days to suppress the mutiny, and afterward, Fidel Castro requested help from the USSR to protect his regime. Khrushchev decided to send his missiles to Cuba a year after the operation. By then, a part of the U.S. nuclear arsenal was already in Turkey, the Soviet Union's neighbor, and locating the missiles in Cuba could restore the balance of terror, as the USSR's General Secretary believed. However, Khrushchev decided to send the nuclear weapons to the island in secret before Americans realized what was going on. Khrushchev had managed to redeploy 40,000 troops and over 160 nuclear warheads to Cuba. On October 16, St. John Kennedy received intelligence information about launching sites for Soviet intermediate range of missiles in Cuba. This date is considered the beginning of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The U.S. president's primary task was to get rid of the missiles in Cuba while at the same time avoiding an exchange of nuclear strikes. Therefore, he argued for a blockade of Cuba rather than invading the island, but since the blockade implies war, it was eventually renamed to a milder term of quarantine. While he was imposing it on October 22, Kennedy couldn't even imagine that in the Sargasso Sea there was a Soviet B-59 summary of transporting nuclear warheads to the Island of Freedom. Created for floating in the northern seas, the underwater craft was having a hard time in the warm water. The temperature inside was rising to critical levels and kept growing, reaching over 30 degrees Celsius. One of the crew members was told that the military mariners had fainted and fallen like dominoes, but by then American destroyers were patrolling the sea straight above the submarine, preventing it from surfacing to charge up its batteries and use its antenna. The submarine's captain Valentin Savitsky knew from previous days reports that a military crisis was building up on shore. However, I am unable to receive radio signals, he couldn't know of recent events. Suddenly, a series of explosions jolted the submarine. Communication specialist Gandhi Orloff compared the feeling to being locked in a metal shell that somebody constantly pounds with a sledgehammer. To avoid escalation, American military ships had to adhere to a protocol in case of a collision with submarines and drop harmless depth charges, ordering the subs to surface. But that day, somebody decided to drop hand grenades in the water. Then Savitsky ordered his crew to prepare to return fire, thinking the war had erupted. Those dropping the grenades didn't realize the B-59 was carrying what the Soviets called special ammunition equipped with a 15-kiloton nuclear warhead. At that moment, only a few seconds separated the world from a nuclear war. Fortunately, a Soviet Navy captain, Vasily Apo, was also on board the Marine. Before heading for Cuba, he carried out a task on the K-19, the first nuclear submarine armed with nuclear weapons. It had been put into operation hastily so as not to lag behind the Americans. In the summer of 1961, the K-9 team was participating in exercises off the Greenland coast when the reactor's cooling system failed. 7 crew members died a week after the incident from radiation exposure, while the rest nicknamed the submarine Hiroshima. Knowing the consequences of nuclear weapons, Apov tried to talk Savitsky out of launching the missiles. Luckily, he succeeded. Had Savitsky's orders been fulfilled, a full-scale nuclear war between the US and the USSR would have erupted. The US would have immediately responded to the strike, launching its missiles from its Turkish base, while the USSR would have reacted momentarily with a launch of its missiles from Cuba. Subsequently, not only the Soviets in America would have suffered, but also Turkey and Cuba would have been wiped out. Such a shootout would have killed between 360 million people. After the mutual nuclear strikes, huge amounts of radioactive dust and smog would have ended up in the atmosphere. Because of this, the temperature all over the planet would have decreased by several degrees, and the nuclear winter would have begun. It would have been followed by mass famine and the deaths of almost half of the Earth's population. Luckily, on that day, the Soviet submarine captain was wise enough not to push the red button. But the world didn't learn that lesson either. 21 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, on September 26, 1939, we found ourselves on the brink of a nuclear disaster again. Early in the morning, 100 kilometers from Moscow, an officer Stanislav Petrov was on duty at a command post of a space-based missile detection system. Petrov received a notification from the early warning systems of a missile strike by the US. The computers showed that several missiles were flying towards the USSR. According to protocol, he was supposed to promptly inform command and the Soviet military would quickly launch a retaliatory nuclear strike. But Pedro decided to disobey orders and not report the strike immediately. He decided to double-check everything. The attendant contacted a group of satellite radar operators, who told him they hadn't registered any missiles, but they could be wrong. Petrov faced a choice, to inform the USSR government of either a missile attack or a possible system malfunction. Had he chosen the former, the information would have reached the country's top leadership in minutes, and the USSR would have carried out a retaliatory nuclear strike on the United States. It's assumed that if a nuclear war between the USSR and the US had begun, the number of victims worldwide would have hit several hundred million people. But in the end, Petrov reported the malfunction in the missile detection system until the last moment. He hesitated, realizing that if he'd been wrong, the explosion would happen within minutes, but it never occurred and Stanislav Petrov became the man who saved the world from nuclear war. But even this wasn't the last time the world was balancing on the edge of doom. On January 25, 1995, the Russian early warning system mistakenly reported a launch of an American ballistic missile off the coast of Norway. President Boris Yeltsin urgently switched his nuclear briefcase to combat readiness mode and ordered a full-scale retaliation strike. But fortunately, at the same moment, the country's leadership received a report that the cause of the alert had been a research rocket launched in Norway to explore polar lights. Had the button been pushed that day, Norway would have vanished from the world map. In its neighboring nation, Sweden, Finland and Denmark for decades would be fighting radiation and nuclear winter, entailing famine and mass death. However, Russia's nuclear attack wouldn't have gone unpunished. Yeltsin's mistake could have triggered a full-scale nuclear war involving the US, China and Europe, but the world still didn't learn the lesson. In early 2023, the doomsday clock stopped for only 90 seconds. From midnight, and it's the shortest distance in its history. They moved the clock by 10 seconds forward because of the war. Russia is unleashing Ukraine. However, not only Ukraine is under the threat of a nuclear attack, but so is Taiwan, which is jeopardized by China. Another country vulnerable to nuclear taxes is Japan. That's because North Korean missiles are directed straight at Tokyo. If world leaders begin a full-scale nuclear war and push their red buttons, 4,500 nuclear bombs will be launched into the air. After they explode, between 150 million tons of radioactive dust will end up in the air and the sun. The seed temperature will drop by almost 7 degrees Celsius. Scientists calculated that in Russia and the US alone, the nuclear war will take the lives of over 3 million. People within the first 45 minutes after the first nuclear explosion, and survivors will have to deal with radioactive fallout and the consequences of radiation exposure. Agriculture on all continents except Australia will be destroyed almost entirely. A global famine may last for over 2 years, leading to the deaths of over 5 billion people. Oh, and by the way, we're talking about a scenario in which only about half of the global nuclear arsenal is used. What will happen if they use it all?